What would you do if the only inheritance left to you was a pittance, barely enough to feed yourself for a winter, let alone build a life? What if the only property that meager sum could afford was a place so steeped in tragedy and ill repute that the world had not only abandoned it, but actively scorned it? This is the story of Florence Ayres, a young woman with nothing left to lose, who in the year 1850 traded her last few sovereigns for the deed to Blackwood Manor, a cursed and crumbling estate on the Cornish coast, for the price of a single healthy horse. The world laughed, but the truth waiting inside the manor's sealed and silent east wing was not a curse, but a confession and a fortune that would rewrite her future and the history of the entire parish. Settle in and stay close. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from as we unfold this story of quiet courage and astonishing discovery. The coach rattled to a halt in the muddy square of St. Morwen, a village that clung to the cliffs like a patch of stubborn lichen. Florence Ayres, her black mourning dress faded to a respectable gray, stepped down onto the slick cobblestones. The air was thick with the smell of salt, damp earth, and coal smoke. It was a smell of endings, not beginnings. She clutched the small, worn reticule that held everything she owned, a letter from a solicitor confirming the transfer of her late father's last remaining funds, and a handful of coins that felt colder and heavier than they should. Her father, a gentle-hearted rector with more books than parishioners, had passed a month prior, leaving her with a legacy of good grammar and an empty larder. The new rector, a man with a sharp-nosed wife and 6 children, had needed the house. Florence at 20 was adrift. She had come to Cornwall on the advice of her father's last letter, which spoke of a distant cousin and the resilient character of the coastal folk. But the cousin, she had learned upon arrival, had emigrated to America a decade ago. The resilience of the folk, thus far, had shown itself only in their tight-lipped appraisal of her worn boots and pale, tired face. She was an outsider, a ghost in her own life, and the sea mist that coiled through the village lanes seemed to seep into her very bones. For a week she had stayed at the local inn, the Salty Dog, her small fund dwindling with every plate of thin stew and every lump of coal for her room's small grate. Her grief was a quiet, constant companion, a physical weight in her chest. She had thought she had understood loss when her mother passed years ago, but this was different. This was the loss of everything, of home, of purpose, of her place in the world. She was a page torn from a book, with no context and no story to follow. It was in the inn's common room, listening to the fisherman's gruff talk and the landlord's gossip, that she first heard the name, Blackwood Manor. It was spoken in a hushed tone, followed by a nervous chuckle, a story told to frighten children and chasten the proud. A cursed place, they said, a house that had swallowed a family's joy and spat out only ruin. The last squire, a man named Arthur Blackwood, had sealed the entire east wing after his elder brother Edward had died there under mysterious circumstances some 30 years ago. Arthur had fled soon after, leaving the estate to rot, and it had been empty ever since. The land was sour, the well was brackish, and the very stones seemed to weep with a misery no sun could warm. The current owner, a solicitor in Truro who had acquired it for unpaid taxes, couldn't give it away. The story, meant to be a chilling tale, sparked something else in Florence. Not hope, exactly, but a flicker of grim, practical curiosity. A house was a house, and she needed one. She had nothing, so what was there to fear from a place that had nothing to offer? The next morning she took the cart to Truro. The solicitor, a Mr. Finch, had looked at her over his spectacles as if she were a curious insect. When she named the property, he had laughed. A dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. He offered it to her for 20 sovereigns, the exact amount left in her account. It was a joke, a dismissal. He expected her to be insulted, to leave. Instead, Florence had simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She would take it. The transaction was swift, the paperwork minimal. It was less a sale than an act of legal abandonment. He handed her a single, enormous iron key, its surface pitted with rust. "The key to the front door," he'd said, a smirk playing on his lips. "The rest, I imagine, you'll have to find for yourself, if you have the stomach to look." The deed was signed, the money paid. Florence Ayres was now the mistress of Blackwood Manor. She had traded all she had for a ghost story and a key. Was this the act of a desperate woman? Or was it the first step of a journey guided by an unseen hand? Was the house truly cursed? Or did it simply hold a secret that no one had ever been brave enough, or broken enough, to uncover? Let us know what you would have done in her shoes. We love reading your comments. And if you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing for more tales of forgotten histories brought to light. Now, with the deed in her hand and the weight of the key in her pocket, Florence had to face the reality of what she had done. The news of her purchase spread through St. Morwen before she had even finished her cup of tea back at the inn. It moved through the village like a flock of starlings, a murmuration of whispers and disbelieving laughter. The landlord polished a glass, his eyes flicking towards her. The women at the market stall fell silent as she passed, their heads turning in unison. She was no longer just a poor unfortunate. She was now a poor fool. The local squire, a portly and red-faced man named Trelawney, who owned most of the surrounding tenant farms, made it a point to confront her directly. He found her outside the baker's, her small loaf of bread wrapped in paper. "Miss Ayres," he boomed, his voice carrying across the square. "I hear you are to be my new neighbor." "Of a sort," he laughed, a loud wheezing sound. "Bought the old Blackwood pile, have you? My congratulations. You've purchased the finest collection of rot and rats in all of Cornwall." A few onlookers tittered. Florence felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks but kept her eyes level. She said nothing. Her silence seemed to provoke him further. "What does a slip of a girl like you want with a ruin? It's an eyesore, a blight. I've made offers for the land myself, to tear it down and put up good pasture. The place has a stain on it, a death stain." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "They say the East Wing is locked for a reason. They say Edward Blackwood's ghost still walks those halls, waiting. You'll be screaming for the mainland before the first frost." He straightened up, satisfied with his performance. A fool's errand. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in a circle of public humiliation. She took a slow breath, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the damp air, and forced her shoulders straight. His words stung, but they were just words. The manor was stone and timber. It was real. That evening, as she was preparing to leave the inn for the last time, an old woman stopped her by the door. She was bent and frail, her face a roadmap of wrinkles. Florence recognized her as Elspeth, the widow of the man who had been the groundskeeper at Blackwood Manor in his youth. The old woman's hand, surprisingly strong, grasped Florence's arm. Her eyes, cloudy with age, were sharp and clear. "They all talk," Elspeth rasped, her voice thin as a winter twig. "But they don't listen." She paused, her gaze fixed on Florence's face. "Some houses hold a breath for a very long time. It is not a kindness to let them choke." Then she released her arm, nodded once, and shuffled away into the twilight, leaving Florence alone with the cryptic weight of her words. A stain, a breath, a fool's errand. The warnings circled in her mind, but beneath them, a harder, more stubborn thought was taking root. She had a key, she had a deed, she had a house. The world could call it what it liked. The next morning, John Carter, a grizzled farmer whose land bordered the Blackwood estate and who had known her father in a distant, kinder past, arrived with his cart as promised. He was a man of few words, but his presence was a small, solid comfort. He loaded her single trunk, which held little more than her father's books and a few spare garments, without comment. He also brought a companion, a lanky, gray-muzzled sheepdog with wise amber eyes who leaned his head against Florence's knee as if they were old friends. "His name is Moss," John said. "He's old, not much for sheep anymore, but he's good company. A quiet soul needs a quiet friend." He did not need to say more. The journey was only a few miles, but it felt like a passage into another country. The lane narrowed, the hedgerows grew wilder and more tangled, thick with hawthorn and ivy. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue over the village, seemed to lower and turn gray. Then, through a gap in the trees, she saw it. Blackwood Manor sat on a low rise overlooking the sea, a dark silhouette against the turbulent sky. It was larger and more dilapidated than she could have ever imagined. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back, slates missing in a scattering of dark patches. Windows gaped open like vacant eyes, and the stone walls were stained black and green with decades of damp. A great skeletal ivy had climbed the western wall, its tendrils reaching into the very mortar. It was not a house, it was a carcass. John Carter pulled the cart to a stop before a pair of immense, rusted gates hanging askew from a granite post. He looked from the house to Florence, his expression grim. "This is it, then?" Florence nodded, unable to speak. Her heart, which had been beating with a nervous, defiant rhythm, now felt like a stone in her chest. Trelawney's words echoed in her ears. A fool's errand. She slid down from the cart, the damp grass soaking the hem of her dress. Moss hopped down beside her, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against her leg. She walked to the gate and put her hand on the cold, rusted iron. It didn't move, of course it didn't. Taking a deep breath, she pulled the huge, ancient key from her pocket. It felt absurdly heavy. She walked past the gates, through a gap where the wall had crumbled, and up the winding, weed-choked drive. The air grew colder as she approached the house, the silence broken only by the cawing of crows and the distant sigh of the sea. The front door was a monstrous thing of oak and iron, braced and studded. It looked as though it had been built to withstand a siege. With trembling hands, Florence pushed the key into the lock. It grated, resisted, then with a final desperate turn, it clicked. The sound was unnervingly loud in the profound silence. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It groaned, shuddered, and swung inward into darkness. That first night, she and Moss slept on the floor of the vast stone-flagged kitchen, the only room with a hearth that looked remotely usable. She had swept a space clear of debris and cobwebs and built a small fire from driftwood she gathered on the beach below the cliffs. The fire sputtered and smoked, offering more comfort than warmth. The rest of the house was a symphony of decay, groaning and creaking around her. The wind howled in the chimneys, and the rain, which had begun just after sunset, found its way through the broken roof, dripping with a maddening, irregular rhythm into the great hall. Lying on her thin blanket, with Moss curled into a warm, breathing weight against her back, Florence felt a wave of despair so profound it was almost a physical sickness. The house was not just empty, it was actively hostile. It was a living, breathing monument to failure, and now it was hers. In the pale, watery light of the first morning, the manor looked even more hopeless. Florence rose, her body aching from the cold stone floor, and began to take stock. The task before her was not a task. It was a geological event. It would take a lifetime, an army. She had neither. She had only her own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to retreat. She started with what was manageable. She cleared the kitchen, scrubbing the great deal table until the pale wood showed through the grime. She found a bucket and began the Sisyphean task of catching the drips in the hall. She spent a day just clearing a path through the brambles to the well, which, to her immense relief, yielded water that was cold and clear, not brackish as the rumors claimed. But as she worked, a small, persistent puzzle began to trouble her. The main body of the house was a warren of drafts. Cold air seeped through window frames, under doors, and from the gaping maw of the main hall fireplace. She spent hours stuffing cracks with rags and moss, but one draft was different. It came from the north wall of the great hall, the wall that was shared, she knew, with the sealed east wing. It was a solid wall of granite blocks, thick and immovable, with no windows and no doors, and yet a steady, chilling stream of air flowed from it, strongest near the floor. It was impossible. She ran her hands over the cold stone, feeling for a crack, a hole, a loose mortar joint. There was nothing. The wall was seamless, perfect. Moss, who had been following her from room to room, stopped at this wall and whined, a low, unhappy sound in the back of his throat. He would not go near it. He would sit 10 feet away, his amber eyes fixed on the stone, a low growl occasionally rumbling in his chest. Florence was a practical woman. She noted the oddity, the physical impossibility of it, but filed it away. A mysterious draft was the least of her concerns. When the roof over her head threatened to collapse, she had to focus on survival, on making a single corner of this vast ruin habitable before the winter came. Yet, the puzzle of the cold air remained, a small, cold question mark at the edge of her thoughts. It was a detail that did not fit, a note of discord in the symphony of decay. At night, when the fire burned low and the house settled into its dark groaning, she would find her eyes drawn to that blank stretch of wall, the source of the inexplicable cold. The house was keeping a secret, and she had just brushed against its edge. Days turned into a week, then a month. A routine born of necessity took hold. Florence would rise with the sun, her first task to fetch water from the well. She and Moss would eat a breakfast of hard bread and cheese, a supply she replenished on a weekly walk to the village, a silent ordeal she endured with stoic patience. The whispers still followed her, but they were now mixed with a grudging, baffled curiosity. No one had expected her to last a week. The bulk of her days were given over to relentless, punishing labor. She became a student of decay, learning the house's weaknesses, its groans and sighs. Her hands, once soft from a life spent with books, became calloused and strong. She learned to patch a roof with scavenged slate, her heart in her throat as she crept across the treacherous, moss-slicked beams. She cleared the wild, tangled mess that had once been a kitchen garden, discovering a gnarled but still living apple tree and a patch of stubborn herbs. Slowly, painstakingly, she was not so much conquering the house as making a truce with it. Her constant companion in this was Moss. The old dog was her shadow, his quiet presence, a balm against the overwhelming loneliness. He would lie in a patch of sun while she worked in the garden, or doze by the fire as she mended her dress by candlelight, his soft snores a comforting counterpoint to the wind's mournful howl. He never left her side, except when she worked near the north wall of the great hall. He maintained his vigil, a silent, furry sentinel guarding against an unseen threat. The mystery of the draft persisted. One afternoon, while sweeping away a thick carpet of dust and rubble from the base of that wall, her broom struck something that was not stone. She knelt, brushing the debris away with her hands. It was a single floorboard, shorter than the others, its grain running in the opposite direction. An old repair, perhaps, but as her fingers traced its outline, she felt a subtle unevenness. She pushed. It didn't move. She tried to pry it up with her fingers, but the wood was swollen tight. Later that week, John Carter came by with a small offering of potatoes and a jug of milk. Seeing the state of her worn-out broom, he also brought a few tools from his own shed. A sturdy hammer, a saw, and a long, flat crowbar. "A house like this needs persuading," was all he said. That evening, by the flickering light of a tallow candle, Florence returned to the floorboard with the crowbar. The house was utterly silent, save for the sound of her own breathing, and Moss's soft whine from the far side of the room. She wedged the tip of the iron bar into the seam and leaned on it. The wood groaned in protest. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. With a sharp crack, the board splintered and came free. She had expected to see the dark, damp earth of the foundation beneath. Instead, she saw a hollow space, and in that space something metallic glinted in the candlelight. It was a small iron ring set into the top of a stone slab. Her heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The cold draft was stronger here, pouring up from the darkness. With trembling hands, Florence gripped the iron ring. It was cold, colder than the surrounding air. She pulled. It was immensely heavy, the stone slab grating against stone. She pulled again, using her whole body. Her feet braced against the floor, slowly, agonizingly. A section of the floor stone lifted, revealing a dark, narrow opening and a set of steep stone steps leading down into blackness. The air that rose up was ancient, stale, and utterly still. It was the smell of a place that had not breathed for a very long time. Taking the candle, and with Moss now whimpering in earnest, she descended. The steps led not to a cellar, but to a narrow brick-lined passage, just wide enough for one person to walk. It ran directly under the north wall. She followed it, her candle flame dancing, casting huge, distorted shadows. After 20 feet, the passage ended at another, even narrower flight of steps, this time leading up. She climbed, her heart a wild drum in her ears. The steps ended at a small, solid oak door, no bigger than a cupboard. There was no knob, only a small, sliding bolt on her side. It was not locked. It slid back with a dry, screeching sound that felt deafeningly loud. She pushed the door open and stepped through. She was no longer in the main house. The air was different here, thick with undisturbed dust, but also strangely preserved. She was in a small pantry or service closet. Before her was another door, a full-sized one. She opened it and stepped out, holding her candle high. She was in a magnificent, two-story library. Bookshelves soared to a carved plaster ceiling. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, and a beautiful, intricate globe stood in the center of the room. Everything, the chairs, the desk, the books, was covered in a thick, uniform blanket of gray dust. Sheets had been thrown over the larger pieces of furniture, making them look like a congregation of silent, hunched figures. This was the East Wing. This was the place that had been sealed for 30 years. Drawn by an invisible current, she moved towards the great mahogany desk. A fine layer of dust covered its surface, but one object had been left clear, a large, leather-bound ledger lying open. The ink on the page was faded but perfectly legible in the still air. The handwriting was a frantic, spidery scrawl. The date at the top of the page was from the summer of 1820. She began to read. "He will not listen," the entry began. "Edward is a fool. He would see this family's fortune squandered on his damnable projects, his machines and his philosophies. He says the future is in iron and steam. I say the future is in land, in stability. He would give it all away. He leaves me no choice." Florence's breath caught in her throat. She read on, the words of Arthur Blackwood spilling out across the page in a torrent of jealousy and rage, a confession of a fratricide. He had confronted his elder brother, Edward, in this very room. They had argued. Arthur, in a fit of rage, had struck him with a heavy brass paperweight. Edward had fallen, his head striking the stone hearth. It was an accident, Arthur claimed, a terrible, tragic accident. But instead of calling for help, he had panicked. He had locked the room. He had sealed the entire wing, telling the world his brother had died of a sudden fever. "I have buried my brother in his own house," the last line read, "and I have buried my soul with him." As Florence read the final damning sentence, her eyes fell upon a heavy brass object on the desk, shaped like an astrolabe, the paperweight. Just below the confession, Arthur had written one last cryptic note. "The true inheritance is safe from his folly. The ship will not sail without its ballast." Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a large, iron-banded sea chest sitting under a window. The ship, the ballast, she ran to it. It was locked, but the key was in the lock, as if left in a hurry. She turned it. The lid was heavy. She lifted it. Inside were blankets, old charts, a sextant. It seemed to be nothing more than a mariner's chest. But remembering the false floorboard, she ran her hands along the inside, tapping, listening. Near the bottom, one side sounded different, hollow. Using the tip of the crowbar, she pried at the wooden lining. It came away, revealing a cunningly concealed false bottom. And inside, nestled in velvet lining that had kept them from tarnishing, were rows upon rows of gold sovereigns. Not a handful, but hundreds. A fortune. The candlelight danced across the metal, filling the silent, dusty room with a warm, liquid glow. It was the treasure at the heart of the curse. That very night the sky broke. The wind, which had been a constant, mournful presence, rose to a furious shriek. It threw itself against the house, rattling the window frames and tearing at the patched-up roof. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, driving sheets, a relentless, percussive assault. The storm was not just a storm. It felt like the house's rage, its pain, finally unleashed. The old manor groaned and shuddered, its ancient timbers crying out under the strain. Florence, her mind still reeling from the discovery in the East Wing, was jolted back to the grim reality of the main hall. A terrible tearing, splintering sound echoed from above, followed by a cascade of water. The section of roof over the great hall, the part she had not yet been able to properly secure, had given way. A torrent of cold rain poured onto the stone flags, flooding the center of the hall and threatening to inundate the kitchen and the other ground floor rooms. She worked frantically, using every bucket and pot she owned to bail the water, her small efforts pitiful against the deluge. The gold in the East Wing felt a world away, a dream. This was the reality, a battle against the elements in a house that seemed determined to destroy itself. Moss cowered by the kitchen hearth, his body trembling with every thunderclap. It was in the midst of this chaos, at the height of the storm's fury, that she heard it. A pounding. Not the wind, not the rain, but a human fist against the great front door. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it. Who would be out on a night like this? The pounding came again, more desperate this time. Wading through the ankle-deep water in the hall, she heaved the heavy bar from the door and pulled it open. A man, a woman, and two small children stood huddled on the doorstep, drenched and terrified. They were the Millers, a family who worked a small tenant farm on the edge of Squire Trelawney's property. "Forgive us, miss," the man stammered, his teeth chattering. "The roof of our cottage. The wind took it. We saw your light." They looked past her into the flooded hall, their faces falling. They had fled one ruin only to find another. But Florence did not see a burden. She saw people in need. "Come in," she said, her voice firm and clear over the roar of the wind. "Get out of the storm, quickly." She led them not into the ruined hall, but into the warm, dry bubble of the kitchen. She sat the children, wrapped in her own blanket, before the fire. She gave the parents hot tea brewed with the last of her supply. Then, without a second thought, she went back into the darkness of the house. She returned not to the perilous main structure, but through the secret passage to the East Wing. She moved with a new purpose, her fear replaced by a steely resolve. From a linen press in one of the preserved bedrooms, she gathered armfuls of clean, dry, lavender-scented sheets and heavy woolen blankets untouched for 30 years. When she returned to the kitchen, she looked less like a victim of the storm, and more like the lady of the manor, providing for those under her roof. She had made her choice. She was not just saving a house, she was rebuilding a home. And her first act as its true mistress was an act of sanctuary. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving a world washed clean and glittering. The air was calm, the sky a bruised but brightening purple. In the kitchen, the Miller family slept, exhausted, the children curled up together under a heavy blackwood blanket. Florence looked at them, a fierce, protective feeling rising in her chest. This was what a house was for, not to hoard wealth or secrets, but to shelter lives. She gave Mr. Miller a piece of bread and one of the gold sovereigns from her pocket. His eyes widened at the sight of the coin. "For the coach to Truro," she said simply. "Find the solicitor, a Mr. Davies. Tell him Florence Ayres of Blackwood Manor requires his presence on an urgent matter. Tell him to bring a clerk and a notary." The man, understanding that a profound shift had occurred, simply nodded and set off at once. The rest of the day was one of strange, quiet waiting. News of the Miller family's refuge at the manor had already begun to filter down to the village. People were stunned. First, that the Millers had survived the storm. Second, that their sanctuary had been the cursed house. And third, that the fool girl had been the one to provide it. By midday, a small crowd of villagers had gathered at the bottom of the drive, not mocking, but staring, their curiosity warring with their fear. Squire Trelawney rode up on his stout cob, his face a thunderous mask. He saw the Miller's children playing near the door with Moss, who seemed to have rediscovered a youthful patience. Trelawney opened his mouth to bellow, but stopped. Florence stood on the top step of the porch, her dress damp and mud-stained, her hair loose, but her posture as straight and unyielding as the granite posts of the gate. There was a new authority in her eyes, a stillness that silenced him. He grumbled something about vagrancy and his tenants, but his words lacked their usual force. The next afternoon, a carriage, improbably clean and official, made its way up the drive. Mr. Davies, the solicitor, stepped out, looking even more severe and skeptical than he had in his office. He took in the scene, the damaged roof, the waiting villagers, the resolute young woman on the steps, with a pinched expression. "Miss Ayres," he began, his tone dripping with professional impatience. "I was told this was urgent." "It is," Florence said, and led him inside. She did not take him to the flooded hall. She led him through the secret passage. She watched his face as he stepped into the preserved stillness of the East Wing, his cynical demeanor melting away, replaced by sheer, unadulterated astonishment. He was a man of paper and precedent, and what she laid before him on the great, dusty desk was irrefutable. The ledger with Arthur's confession, the sea chest, the gold. His clerk, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers, counted and weighed the sovereigns, his hands trembling slightly. Mr. Davies read the confession, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked from the ledger to Florence, and for the first time he saw her. He saw not a foolish girl, but the quiet, undeniable inheritor of a powerful truth. "This," he stammered, "this changes everything. The terms of Edward Blackwood's original will. He left everything to charity and the furtherance of knowledge if he died without heir. But Arthur was never the legal heir. The estate, the fortune, it has been in abeyance. Legally it belongs to the crown, unless a legitimate claimant." He trailed off, looking at the sheer volume of the fortune. "But your discovery," he said, his voice now full of a new respect. "Your salvage of the property. The crown is often generous, very generous." The villagers saw the solicitor and his clerk emerge. Hours later, their faces pale with shock and reverence. The secret was out. The curse was broken. It was never a ghost. It was a crime. And Florence Ayres was the one who had brought it into the light. The golden hour of a late autumn afternoon settled over Blackwood Manor, bathing the old stones in a soft, forgiving light. A month had passed since the solicitor's visit. The house was no longer silent. The sound of hammers and saws echoed from the roof, where John Carter and two of the Miller boys worked, their labor paid for with coin that had not seen the sun in 3 decades. The great hall was dry, its floors scrubbed clean. The gardens were being tamed, their structure re-emerging from the chaos. The house was breathing again, a slow, deep, steady breath. It was becoming what it had always meant to be. Florence stood on the front steps, a position that was now comfortably her own, watching the light change on the sea. Moss, her quiet, constant friend, rested his heavy head on her knee. The village of St. Morwen had been transformed. The whispers had turned to murmurs of awe. They no longer called her the fool girl. They called her the Lady of Blackwood. Offers of help came daily. The baker sent up fresh bread. The blacksmith offered to repair the gates. It was not charity, it was tribute. She had not just saved a house, she had restored a piece of the parish's soul, replacing a dark legend with a story of truth and quiet courage. Squire Trelawney had not been seen in weeks. It was said he was keeping to his own house, his bluster finally exhausted. He had been humbled not by force, but by the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. John Carter came down from the roof, wiping his hands on a rag. He stood beside her, following her gaze out to the horizon. "Mr. Davies says the papers from London are signed," he said quietly. "The Crown has granted you title to the house, the land, and a finder's portion of the gold that would make a queen blush." He paused. "What will you do with it all?" Florence looked at the house, at its newly mended roofline catching the last rays of the sun. She thought of the library, filled with Edward Blackwood's books on science and philosophy. She thought of the Miller children, who would now have a proper cottage and a good school to attend. She thought of the breath the house had been holding for so long, now released. "I thought I was buying a house," she said, her voice soft but clear in the still evening air. "But I was just giving it back its memory. Thank you for staying with us to the very end of this journey." This has been a story about the quiet power of stewardship and how the things our world hastily discards often hold the very keys to our future. If you found a little piece of your own heart in Florence's story, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more tales of hidden history and quiet triumph. We have another story waiting for you, about a forgotten box of letters and a family secret that changed the course of a river. Until then, be well.